My name is Craig Peterson, and my position is as Associate Conference Minister for Congregational Development with the Central Atlantic Conference of the United Church of Christ. And one of my many duties is supporting our 45 congregations here throughout the state of New Jersey. And within that realm of congregational development includes things like member care. And so that's why a part of the reason why this evening I worked with Matt to make tonight happen. So as I start off this evening, I want to speak a little bit about why I think it's so important to have a leader from a faith community be a part of the conversation tonight. When you look at the earliest development of the years, some of the sacred stories of our faith told stories that within the pre-modern context of the time talked about things like possessions or things coming into people. And because of that, a lot of individuals over the centuries, there was sort of a stigma around mental health issues. It was equated with brokenness or sinfulness. And because of that, that stigma led many people to not seek help or support. Even later, as congregations began to get some sense of what was going on, their tendency was still to try to deal with these matters in-house. And the reality was a lot of our faith leaders and well-intentioned lay leaders simply didn't have the skills or the training they needed to deal with mental health issues in the most effective ways. So in the last couple decades, there has been much more intentional effort to bridge the divide between service providers and members of various faith communities. So that's sort of what led us here. And that work to bridge the gap has proven successful. For instance, within the Christian tradition over the last 2 or 3 decades, during the Christmas season, we have started to celebrate a service called, or observe a service called Blue Christmas, which is an acknowledgement that not for everyone is Christmas a joyful time. For some, it's triggering and can be a particularly painful time. And so there are many of our faith communities who are beginning to give people an outlet to process that. Many faith leaders, like myself when I served congregations, also began to look at the treatment of mental health and incorporate it within this notion of spiritual disciplines. I used to tell congregants that when it comes to spiritual disciplines, it includes not just things like reading the sacred scriptures of our faith or praying, but that it also included things like taking medication and establishing and committing to ongoing relationship with service providers. So that's some of the momentum that has led us here this evening. In a moment, I will have the primary presenter introduce himself, Matt Camarda. But I want to give you just a taste of what to expect tonight in our hour together. So Matt will introduce himself in a moment, and then he'll talk with us a little bit about what this thing called 988 is. Everything from a brief history to what to expect if you or a loved one calls. After that first section, we'll take a little time to recount a personal experience of one who has used the 988 service. And then we'll move into a conversation about the 988 crisis continuum, what each of the 4 pieces of the system is designed to do, so that if we need to explain it to others, we're a little more able to do that. And then we'll end with an advocacy piece tonight, because learning is important, but it needs to be translated into action if these services are to take root and expand within our communities. So I thank you for your patience with my introduction this evening. And with that, I will turn things over to Matt to introduce himself and to get us started this evening. If you do have a burning question as Matt talks, you can go ahead and put the question in the chat box. And at an appropriate break or portion of the evening, I'll feed your questions to Matt. So with that, Matt, you can go ahead and take that away.
Thank you very much, Greg, for your introduction. I'm really happy to be joining you all tonight. My name is Matt Camarda. I am the Advocacy and Public Policy Director for the National Alliance on Mental Illness of New Jersey. We are a grassroots nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the lives of all affected by mental illness. So we provide education, support, outreach, and advocacy to help those affected by mental illness build better lives. I'm always happy to be a part of conversations like this, especially from the faith perspective, because I don't always think that it's as represented as it could be in these discussions. And I'm also glad for the timing of this event because, as we all know, that Christmas and the holidays can be a really difficult, challenging time for people for a variety of reasons. It could be related to mental health challenges. It could be related to grieving a loved one. People can be, in lonely situations where they just don't have anyone around. So there's a lot of reasons why it's important to talk about the 988 suicide and crisis lifeline, especially during this time of year. And it's also important, as Craig mentioned, for the advocacy piece to talk about in the context of nationwide cuts to healthcare and food assistance that might exacerbate the mental health challenges and the stresses that the average person, might be dealing with, and especially those who are dealing with mental illness already may be even more affected by these cuts. So, oh, sorry, Craig, you were gonna say
I
something.
was just going to simply, as we sort of transition in, before we get too much deeper into the program, if you wouldn't mind taking some time this evening and helping us better understand what exactly is 988.
Absolutely. And I'm going to share my screen because I have a couple of slides to aid in that description. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is the three-digit number established for suicidal, mental health, and substance use crises. This was established as part of the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act of 2020. This followed an FCC ruling or an FCC recommendation of the creation of a three-digit line that would replace the 10-digit National Suicide Prevention Lifeline that many people surely have seen, signs for in various places where, someone might be at risk of suicide. This number officially went online, meaning that you could call it, from anywhere on July 16th, 2022. And this number is very important, not just because, we need an easy way for people to access it, but it's based on the idea that a person in a mental health crisis deserves a mental health response. And we say that because oftentimes in a mental health emergency, the, default is to call 911. And with 911 and mental health, that often usually brings the police. And while we have programs in New Jersey like CIT and Arrive Together, we know that oftentimes a police response really is not what is, most needed for the person. Most people who are experiencing a behavioral health crisis don't need a police response or hospitalization. Often they need just someone to talk to, and in cases, that are more serious than that, they may need to meet with someone in person. They may need, medication adjustment, counseling, etc. But all things that are, not as intensive as someone being, hospitalized. Oftentimes that's much more traumatic, more expensive, taxing to the whole system. And so we think of 988 as an alternative to those more intensive solutions that people, oftentimes experience during a crisis that don't help them in the way that they're really supposed to help them.
Matt, you used an acronym, and I know that sometimes they can be dangerous because not everyone knows what they mean. When you were talking about a police or the response, you said CIT. Could you explain what a CIT is?
Absolutely. CIT stands for Crisis Intervention Team or Crisis Intervention Team Training, which is a program that was modeled in Memphis, but was also significantly aided by like a grant from NAMI National about a couple of decades ago. And the idea was to train law enforcement and mental health professionals in crisis response and helping them to understand things like mental illness and addiction and other behavioral health issues like, developmental disabilities that like really can aid police in responding to situations where somebody is experiencing a crisis. We have these programs in New Jersey where I believe in every county in the state there are classes held at least once a year where police can be trained in CIT, and it's a 40-hour, 1 week long program for law enforcement and also for other crisis personnel who might be responding on the scene.
Great. Thank you for that explanation.
Sure, absolutely. And so, one of the things that is important to note when we talk about 988 is that oftentimes it gets compared to the other crisis numbers that people may call. That includes 911 and that includes 211. And so, it's important when we talk about 988 to understand when it is appropriate to call, 988 versus 911. So, as I said before, 988 is for suicidal, mental health, and substance use crises. Previously, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline was just for, suicidal crises, but when we expanded to 988, we also expanded to general mental health and substance use crises as well. So if somebody is struggling with one of those things, if they're not in an immediate danger to themselves or others, 988 is an appropriate number for them. 911 is for those immediate life-threatening situations that require an in-person response. If someone is thinking about, they're having, suicidal thoughts, but they're not actively, about to, harm themselves, 988 would be appropriate. But if they are in the process of doing that, 911 is absolutely the number that they should call. If someone is, at outright danger to themselves or others, then that would require, a 911 call. And if you call 988 and the counselor makes that determination, which is very rare, I'm gonna, in another slide, go over just how rare that is. There are cases where they would need to call 911, but it's extremely rare. And then for 211, that is a referral service for basic needs like food, utilities, shelter, etc. So if you're in need of basic necessities and you're trying to figure out where to get them, 211 would be the appropriate number to call. And as far as how to access 988, there are three methods available for someone to call to reach 988. They can obviously dial 988 and call, they can text 988, or they can go on the website and chat online with 988. And it's important to note that 988 has changed a little bit in how people get directed from it. In the past, calls and texts were routed based on a person's area code, meaning that if you had an area code that was not, is different from where you currently live, as many of us do, you would be getting, maybe a less accurate, still potentially helpful, but less accurate in terms of your location. However, due to recent FCC rules, mobile service providers are going to be required, and in many cases already are, geo-routing calls and texts to your local Lifeline call center, meaning that, say, if you might have an area code in Florida, but if you live in New Jersey, it's going to route you to a Lifeline center in New Jersey. However, it's not going to reveal your exact location. Geo-routing does not do that, and so it's intended to preserve the person's privacy. And as I had said earlier, there might be cases where somebody isn't in imminent risk to themselves or others, and in those rare cases, a counselor may have to call 911 for an emergency rescue. However, in New Jersey, the stats show that that has happened in less than 1% of calls. So it's very rare that that happens to an
Matt, if I can jump
individual.
in, from a faith leader perspective, that fifth point about the preservation of privacy is such an important piece that I just want to really doubly emphasize that it's a safe place to call where you won't be labeled or judged.
Absolutely. So for these slides, I essentially took them from the 988 website because I felt that that would be the most accurate way of describing each of these methods of how you would contact 988 and what would happen when you do. When you call 988, you'll hear a message that gives you the service selection options, including veterans +1, Spanish language +2. And if it's neither of those, then they'll send you to your local Lifeline center. Unfortunately, there was a Press 3 option for LGBTQ youth, but that was discontinued as of, I believe, July of this year. That's something that NAMI has been advocating on recently, and we hope to eventually have it restored. But for now, it's just those two options. But of course, anyone, no matter, their gender identity, sexual orientation, can call, reach out to 988 and still get a response. So then after that, you'll hear some hold music while you get connected to a person. And then once you get connected to a counselor, they'll say hello, introduce themselves, and they'll ask you, if you're safe, if you're okay. And then after they ask, they'll listen to you, they'll understand how your problem is affecting you and provide support and any local resources that they believe might be helpful to you. And then when you text 988, you'll be given options to connect with a live counselor from the main, Lifeline centers or Spanish language. When you text next, you'll be accepting their terms of service. It says you'll be asked to complete a brief survey to understand how your counselor can help you. You'll get a wait message, and then you'll have a counselor introduce themselves, and then, the process will be similar to that of a phone call. And then with chat, I believe the only difference is that you have to fill out a brief survey before you actually get connected with somebody so they can understand how best to help you. And you hit start a chat and you'll, pretty much have the same process as a text message or a phone call once you get connected to a counselor.
Excellent. You know, what I really like about what you're saying, Matt, and I think a challenge for us, it's easy for us to present this to a loved one in as if there were only one option, like you should call 988. But we know that different generations you prefer different mediums. So the Gen Xers like me might prefer to make a call. Millennials might prefer an option like texting, and Gen Zs might prefer the chat function. So thank you for reminding us of all the options.
That's absolutely true. I know, there's people in my life who they could talk to somebody eventually, but it might be hard for them to initiate that first call.
Yep.
A lot of people in my age group and younger have a really hard time making phone calls. It's just, something that they're not used to in that generation, in my generation. I totally get it as an introverted person that it might be easier for a person to chat or text as opposed to making a phone call, even though, of course, the person on the other end is going to still give a compassionate response no matter what the medium is.
Yes. So, for those who may have joined us after we began, we are taping tonight's presentation as we have a number of folks who had registered but are unable to be with us. So, if you don't want to have a visual image portrayed, you can turn your camera off, and just want to make sure you were aware. So, Matt's done a beautiful job laying out the first section. And as we prepared for this evening, we thought it's helpful for some of those of us who provide services to talk a little bit from a more personal or firsthand experience, because many of us do the work for a variety of reasons. I know I was in a 10-year relationship with someone who struggled with both severe depression and anxiety. And I'll never forget the day I found a suicide note declaring his intention to do that. And that really changed my life forever. Matt, if you wouldn't mind switching gears, if you're comfortable, to talk a little bit about your own experience, perhaps with 988 and the access of service.
Absolutely, Craig. I would be happy to talk about that. I had my own experience with 988. I mean, I've spent the last several years in this job advocating for 988 and making sure that we have a strong response, but I didn't I didn't know whether I was going to need it. But last year, both my wife and I were going through a really difficult time mental health wise. We were both struggling, and I was really worried about her, and I was, not really sure where to turn. And on my way to, picking her up, I called 988, and I didn't know what to expect because I had never done it before. Um, but I'm glad to say that the experience that I did have was a very positive one. I will say that it didn't take a particularly long time to get connected with someone after I went through the, press one, press two. At that time, it was also press three. But I think once I had gotten a hold of a counselor, I think that the hold time wasn't any more than 30 seconds or so, which I was happy that it was a relatively fast experience for me. And the person that I spoke with was very patient. She was very compassionate and really did help me cope with the situation that I was experiencing as someone who did have a therapist at the time. So it wasn't that I didn't have any care, but it's hard because if you have a therapist, that you're probably meeting them at most, once a week. For people who aren't so lucky, maybe it's every other week. And so you oftentimes, I think one of the things that it's useful for is it can be a bridge. And it was a bridge for me. And like I said, the person that I talked to was very kind. She was very helpful in terms of suggestions that she made about places that I could go to for care and for my wife. And one thing that I really appreciated in the interaction was she never tried to rush me. Um, and that's something knowing that we're trying to get more, staff for these Lifeline centers. And, we want to make sure that, you know, all the calls are being answered in state. And so, in my own head, I'm thinking, man, this person might be under pressure to try and end this phone call, in a reasonable amount of time. But we ended up having, at least a 20-minute conversation. And I was really relieved that by the time I was done, I felt like I wasn't, I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel like this person was like, okay, I need to, I need to go help somebody else. They were with me in that moment where I was struggling. And when I was done talking to them, I felt like I was able to face what was right in front of me. And um, after that, I felt like I know that what we're dealing with is really hard, but I feel like we're able to move forward. And my wife and I were able to move forward, and she was able to get the help that she needed, and is in a much better place today than, because she got the help that she needed. And while there's a lot of different factors that go into that, I do feel that in that situation, 988 really helped me, and it helped us move forward in that small way at least.
Matt, what I
And
loved about your story, and I really want to highlight, is that really we can think of 988 as a part of a larger care team. Because many of us might tell ourselves, well, I have a rabbi or a pastor or an imam or I have a therapist, so maybe I should just wait 3 days until I can talk to them. But, this is a reminder that there are things in our lives that take us to a moment where we need something sooner than 72 hours, and that this can sort of bridge or fill that gap. So thank you for that.
absolutely. I know that, for some people they might be struggling and maybe it can wait, it can wait until, they're able to talk to, whether it's a spiritual leader or a parent or a friend or, sibling or a spouse or a therapist or whoever. But it isn't always the case that it can wait. And
Yeah,
in those cases when it can't wait, it's really important that we have this resource for people. And I know it helped me a lot. And I know that on the day that I called 988, not only was I struggling with mental health, I had a webinar just similar to the one that we're having right now. And so in addition to the struggles that I was dealing with, I was wondering how on earth I was going to get through, you know, a presentation that I was hosting through NAMI, New Jersey. So all of that being said, I found it incredibly helpful to me, and I know that others have been helped by it as well.
great. So thank you, Matt, for being vulnerable and sharing your story, because I think it's when folks like you and I take a piece of our story and share it, we chip away at some of the stigma, and we remind folks that each of us has a role to play, and a variety of roles. So the next piece of our evening is to talk a little bit. I talked a moment ago about a care team, but now we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about the crisis of continuum from that 988 is a part of. And Matt, if you would share some of these four pieces and what each of those four are designed to do.
Absolutely. So when we talk about 988, when NAMI talks about 988, and when the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services talks about 988, and other advocacy organizations talk about 988, we're not just talking about the number. It's really about the full continuum of care, of services that is supposed to surround 988 and the person in crisis. We're talking about someone to call, we're talking about someone to respond, and we're talking about a safe place to go. These three pillars are consistent with SAMHSA's best practices that New Jersey is working off of, that we are using to build a model that encompasses them. We're talking about local call centers. We're talking about mobile crisis teams, or in New Jersey's case, they're called mobile crisis outreach response teams that respond to a person in a crisis with mental health professionals, including peers, and without law enforcement. That piece is very important. We're also talking about crisis receiving and stabilization centers that accept all referrals and provide short-term crisis stabilization in a home-like environment. These are really important because it provides an alternative in cases where, someone might be arrested, they might be brought to an emergency room, and instead they can be brought to this center that is a lot more therapeutic than an emergency room or obviously a jail, where somebody can get the help that they need quickly, as opposed to waiting, a really long time in an emergency room. And then New Jersey is also creating crisis diversion homes that is sort of an extension of the stabilization centers, but they're more like transitional housing for up to 30 days for people who might be at risk of being hospitalized that need more care and in, the time that can be allotted for, a temporary stabilization center.
Matt, could I ask about one of the acronyms in that slide for those who may not know? If you could go back that previous slide. I saw that it said SAMHSA's best practice. Could you share with us what SAMHSA is?
Absolutely. SAMHSA stands for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. That
Right.
is the federal agency that is housed under Health and Human Services that covers mental health and addiction.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
that is that's the agency where all of the sort of like the federal, mental health and substance use grant funding flows from. It is also an agency that is in transition right now because the current administration is proposing to essentially merge it under the banner of a new agency and end it sort of the way that it currently exists. So SAMHSA still exists, but it's also been proposed to be dismantled and sort of reorganized under a new banner.
Thank you for that.
Absolutely. So I touched on the local Lifeline centers already, so I'm not going to really get too much into that, except that just to provide the centers that we currently have in New Jersey, contact of Mercer County, Rutgers University Behavioral Health Care, Mental Health Association of New Jersey, and Caring Contact in Westfield. These are the
Good.
four centers that we have. There was a fifth one that I think that left at some point. So right now we have four centers.
Matt, one thing I would ask is, will you be able to forward a copy of the slides to those who've registered just so that they can, if they're not able to take notes, get the information?
Yeah, I can do that. And somebody actually had written in the chat and a really important question,
Yes.
and it's something that I'm actually going to get into. But I said in progress because it's something that is in the process of opening, but is also at risk. Um, and also, I saw somebody said nothing covering South Jersey, and I can address that too. So the stabilization centers are in the process of being established. They have been awarded grants. So the organizations that are going to run them have been awarded the grants, and they are, from what I gather, fairly close to opening them. However, funding is in doubt long term, and that's something that I'm going to get into. And then the other person that I saw wrote in the chat, nothing covering South Jersey. Um, Just because there isn't a call center in South Jersey doesn't mean that you wouldn't get a localized response from the call center. They're intended to cover, the full, 21 counties of New Jersey. So just because someone you know might be calling from South Jersey and they get, say, contact of Mercer County, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't necessarily get a response. They wouldn't get information that would be not necessarily South specific to South Jersey. They still would get information that would potentially be specific to their area.
Now, the last question is 988 a 24-hour, 7-day a week service, including holidays and all that?
Yes, it is.
Great.
Yes. Yes, it is. So the second piece that I wanted to talk about was the Mobile Crisis Outreach Response Teams, or MCORTs. This service is also intended to be available 24/7, 365 days a year. The way that it is currently set up is that there are 62 teams across 9 regions. There are counties grouped into each of the 9 regions. They have some of that information on the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services website on, what region, each county is in. But the teams themselves are comprised of a bachelor's level mental health professional and a peer support specialist, and each of them is remotely supervised by a master's level clinician. And the idea behind them is that, let's say you call 988 and the counselor that you're speaking with determines that you might need more help than can be provided over the phone. If they determine that that's helpful, they will dispatch an M-Court to your location voluntarily. So the person, has to agree to it. This is a, totally voluntary um, system, which is different from the screeners who are there to determine like whether somebody needs to be involuntarily committed. M-Courts are there voluntarily, dispatched to the person in crisis, and they're intended to de-escalate the person and link them to services in the community and follow up within 72 hours. And they can also provide transportation to other sites if needed, including intention is that they can also be providing transport to the crisis receiving and stabilization centers, like when those are, stood up. And an important statistic that I had found when I was putting this presentation together is that um, law enforcement is intended only, as necessary, and in only 5% of cases was 911 called when the M-Courts did arrive. So the other 95% of the time did not, result in 911 being called.
Great. Matt, one question that Kathleen raised is what level of certification do the counselors have as a part of the team?
So I don't know all of the certifications that they have. I just know that the peer support specialist, I'm assuming, would have a peer specialist certification. I know that the person supervising them would have a master's level degree, and that the person with the peer support specialist would have a bachelor's level. But beyond that, I don't know what specific other certifications that the individuals on the M courts would have. That would be like a good question for the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services.
Excellent. And that's a good reminder that if there are follow-up questions, they could contact you and you could put them in touch with the appropriate agency
Yes.
or entity.
Yes, absolutely. And so the third piece that I had mentioned earlier are the crisis receiving and stabilization centers. They are intended to be regionalized, so they wouldn't be in every county, but you don't need to live in that county that it's in order to access it. So right now, the expectation is that there would be 5, one in Morris, one in Bergen, one in Essex, one in Monmouth, and one in Camden. So there is a mix of South, Central, and North Jersey in there. And it's intended to be staffed with a wide variety of positions to sort of encompass the full, range of needs that a person in crisis would, potentially have. That includes counselors, nurses, prescribers, SUD specialists, and peers. And again, with the Lifeline and the M courts, the intention is to continue to divert people away from law enforcement, away from emergency rooms, unnecessary hospitalizations, things that may be traumatizing toward a person, and allow them to get care that they need in a really therapeutic setting. And this is still in progress. These haven't opened yet, and long-term funding for these centers isn't guaranteed. The reason being that when the grants, when the funding awards went out, the state was relying upon federal COVID dollars to, stand these centers up with the expectation that they would be funded with state dollars or combination of state dollars and federal dollars. I will get into that in a little bit on the advocacy piece because that's really important.
Matt, we have a couple great questions. The first question comes from Kathleen, and who asks, so a caregiver to a person in psychosis who might call 988 would be unable to get help if the person, him or herself, was unable to agree. Is that correct?
So in the case of 988, I believe that in the case of say an M court, if that person was not willing to agree, I don't think that they could necessarily force that person to do anything. They could potentially show up, but if the person is, and they might try to speak with the person, but if the person is completely unwilling to speak with them, and unwilling to engage in any way, I don't think that they can really force the person to do anything. If that person is concerned that they might be a danger, they could always call, screening, and screening could come out. But
Okay.
in the case of specifically 988 and M courts, that piece is intended to be, voluntary.
And is
Obviously,
it,
the screening is more on the involuntary side of things. But the
right.
idea is that they're there to talk to the person and help de-escalate the crisis that they're in.
Sorry, Karen has a question. How long might a person be able to stay in a CRSC that we just talked about?
So a CRSC is intended to be under 24 hours. They call them like 23-hour centers. So the idea is like that a person would spend no more than a day or just under a day in those centers, and that they would be then connected with other care um, after that point.
Okay,
And then the other service that I was going to mention, the crisis diversion homes, is sort of meant to be like another piece if the person needs additional help and needs to stay somewhere but doesn't necessarily need to be hospitalized. But the
mhm,
idea behind a CRSC is it's temporary. It's to help the person stabilize and within that like less than 24-hour period.
excellent. The last question that we have so far in this section is kind of a broader question. What exactly is screening when you talk about screening?
So screening in New Jersey, or its past psychiatric emergency screening service, is a service that is used if someone, um, believes that a person is a danger to themselves or others. They can call screening the like psychiatric screeners who will come out and they will evaluate a person to determine whether that person is potentially, a danger to themselves or others that, they potentially need to be, involuntarily held.
Great.
And
Well, thank
oftentimes that the screening is going to be, accompanied by police. And the how do you get a hold of screeners is the follow-up question. There's a if you search, psychiatric emergency screening in New Jersey, um, I believe it's the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services that has a full list in each county, because each county has its own screening service, and so you would call the number um, on your county that there's a each provider, each county has its own screener provider.
great. Thank you. And we'll let you move on. I think to the fourth area.
Yeah, so the fourth area is crisis diversion homes. Um, and they offer up to 30 days of transitional housing, stabilization services. Each houses up to 5 individuals. There's one intended to be one in Warren, Mercer, and Gloucester County. I don't know. I think that they are in the process of being opened, but I know that they're also supposed to be um, long-term funded, but the state hasn't quite funded them yet. I'm not 100% sure of um, exactly what the status of each of those crisis diversion homes are, whether they've all been, completely implemented or whether they're in progress. But I know that that's intended to be that next piece of the, 988 crisis continuum of care. And then underneath, I have services. There's a lot of different services, including clinical assessment, case management, assistance with obtaining benefits, symptom management, medication management, education, counseling, and discharge planning.
Great. Is it possible, Matt, that an individual could go from the previous CSRC, the 24-hour piece of care, right directly into the crisis diversion home, or is there a separation?
So the intention, I think, behind these homes is that they're supposed to be taking referrals from the M courts and from the crisis receiving and stabilization centers, and
Okay,
that those would be sort of prioritized among, the people who would be considered for those crisis diversion homes.
great. And Susan has a really important question, especially these days with some of the uncertainty in health insurance care and coverage. Does the CDHS have to be approved by insurance?
That's a good question. I don't know to what extent, insurance will be, insurance approval will be required for being able to access them. But the idea behind them is that anyone should be able to go there and get care no matter their insurance situation. That's
Excellent.
that's what the intention behind those centers are. But I also don't know exactly how insurance is going to interact with them, whether, insurance will be billed in all cases or whether it will, only be billed in some cases. That's a really good question and one that I'm not exactly sure of the full answer, in part because these centers haven't, fully opened yet.
Excellent. As we get prepared in a moment to move away from the continuum here into the last portion, the advocacy piece, in the previous section, you talked about calling counties in terms of accessing screeners. Is there a specific department of a county that people should look for that could help them find their way to a screener in that county?
I think that their best bet would be like their, county health department. Counties have their own like, mental health side of their health department. I would get in touch with them. I'm not 100% sure in each county how it works, but I do know that in each, um, county, they do have their own screening service, and there are providers and phone numbers that there's a, directory online of all of those providers. I don't have it on me at the moment, but somebody could look that up and find all of the counties if they were looking for it, if they wanted to
Great.
find them.
So the last major piece that we want to cover in the last roughly 10 or 15 minutes here is an advocacy piece. And for those who are listening carefully, there were several times this evening where you talked a little bit about the vulnerability of the funding. Sometimes we assume that this is simply a national service and that it's covered. And yet that's not necessarily the reality. So could you talk with us a little bit about, again, the vulnerability of funding, and then maybe bridge into pieces of legislation we might be cued in to support or be aware of so that we can make sure these resources don't get cut and go away?
Absolutely. And when you said, oh, it's a federal national system, like it is and it isn't.
Ah,
It is in the sense that if you call 988 or text 988 or chat 988 from anywhere, you will get a response. However, the quality and the content of that response, the services that come with that response are going to differ based on the state that you're in. And that's because there really isn't permanent, long-term funding at the federal level for any solutions behind, besides just the number. There's federal funding that goes with, the infrastructure of 988, making sure that, the technical infrastructure and making sure that there's, grants that go out to states to fund their lifeline centers. But it's not enough, to sustain the entire system in every state. Each state needs to provide their own funds in order to really sustain a robust 988 response. And so there's why I say up here, there is no permanent sustainable funding mechanism for 988 crisis services in New Jersey. It really depends on, right now, it depends on federal and state appropriations. And one of the things that the federal law that created 988 did was it allows each state to fund 988 crisis services with fees on mobile phones like the ones we already pay for 911. We already pay a 90 cent per month fee for 911 in New Jersey. And now, as of today, there are 12 states that have enacted a 988 fee that allow them to pay for their 988 system. Something that NAMI and many organizations, both in New Jersey and nationally, have pushed for is for us to have such a fee so that we as a state don't have to rely on year end, budget funding for these services because we know that funding can be unreliable. One of the things that's really important for people to know from a governmental or state governmental perspective is that unlike the federal government, the state government cannot borrow year after year after year to meet its expenses. We have to have a balanced budget every single year. And what that means is if there is a recession, if there is an economic downturn, the state has to make really serious choices about what it funds and what it doesn't fund. And that means if there's a recession, either taxes have to go up or funding for services has to be cut. And that's something that NAMI New Jersey and other organizations are very concerned about because while it's all well and good to say we're funding certain services each year in the budget, it's not a guarantee that it will be funded every year. It's only a guarantee that it will be funded, for this year. And if there's an economic downturn, oftentimes what has to happen is there need to be adjustments to the state budget within the year because the revenues aren't meeting the budgeted amount of revenues, and so they have to adjust the amount of spending in order to, compensate for that fact. So we as an organization, many organizations, including Mental Health Association New Jersey, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention New Jersey, we have been advocating for a fee that would protect these services in New Jersey. This past year, Governor Murphy proposed such a fee in his budget, but it was rejected by the legislature. They did not go for it. Without a permanent source of funding, these services are vulnerable. And I want to highlight in particular the crisis receiving and stabilization centers are particularly at risk because the intention behind that fee was that it was going to cover all these services, including CRSCs. And past appropriations have funded the Lifeline and they've funded the M-Courts, but they have not funded the CRSCs. And if they are not funded, they won't be able to open. And so they're right now relying on federal funding that's going to expire next year. And so that means that if we as a state don't find a way to fund them, they won't open. And we're going to lose that really valuable resource for people in crisis that would enable them to get treatment rather than, say, having to go to an emergency room and wait a really long time and not get the best care that they could have gotten in a more therapeutic setting or be in a jail cell. So after the fee did not pass in the budget, a bill was introduced that would essentially codify such a fee. And that legislation we have been supporting the last several months. And the legislation is S4502, A5972. And there's been multiple articles in various New Jersey publications like NJ.com and NJ Spotlight that have highlighted the need for this fee in our state and the various efforts being made to establish it. We, as part of this presentation, we're definitely asking everybody on this call to please ask their legislators to support this, legislation. I have a QR code here that links to the campaign that we have up. I have the link here. I can, send both of those out too. But
Good.
this is a really important advocacy piece for everyone because um, the long-term funding is important. One, because we want to make sure that these services last, a really long time. But we also want to make sure that they get up and running at all. And if we don't get the funding in some shape or form, at least the CRSCs may not happen at all. And that's really concerning. So it's sort of like a short-term issue and a long-term issue. And we're trying to raise, you know, the importance of the short term because I think legislators tend to respond to, short-term concerns a little bit quicker because, it's more of an emergency. Whereas the long term is a little bit harder, but they're both equal, they're both important. And we really need funding for this continuum because we know that it, can save lives. It already has saved lives. And this is just I just wanted to highlight what the campaign looks like when you click on the link. Um, if you put your information in, it'll direct you to a draft of an email that you can send and that you can edit with your own information that, is personal to you about why it's important that we have a, crisis system that, anyone can turn to when they need help. And I noticed we had a couple of
Yeah, we had an exchange of
pest
resources,
screening.
which is really wonderful.
That's wonderful. Pest screening. Yes.
Yeah,
Great.
Krista gave the PESS screening in New Jersey by county. And so for those who are watching this at a later date, again, this is an acronym. P is in Pennsylvania, E is in excellent, SS screening in New Jersey by county. And that should pull up the site. And one thing that you were talking about, Matt, there, when it comes to NAMI, for instance, at the national level as well as the state level, sometimes folks are less clear about, well, if I give to one level of NAMI, what's the significance of giving to another? And as you've been talking tonight, it's really clear that NAMI National does certain things, but that our local chapter here in New Jersey is important and is in need of its own resources to do its work. I do not work for NAMI. I'm simply a supporter myself, so I wanted to take a moment and make that plug.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, I didn't come here to make a fundraising appeal, but yes, each level of NAMI does really important work, whether it's the national level, whether it's the, national state organizations or whether it's the county affiliates. We in New Jersey have affiliates in all 21 counties and they all do amazing work.
Great. And I'm particularly as we close this evening, and we may stop recording and let those who are live linger and ask questions if they so choose. But I was really pleased that you said there's an opportunity to personalize the letter to legislators, because what I've learned as a faith leader is, and I know that not all of us can share firsthand stories of either ourself or a loved one who's needed services. But for those who are in a position to be able to share experience, that really helps go a long way in establishing need and generating support. So thank you for the encouragement to personalize. So with that, I want to thank Matt for his time this evening and his leadership as we head into this holiday season. I'm hoping that as you receive a link to tonight's presentation and perhaps a link to the slides as well, that you'll feel encouraged to share that with others, because it's particularly important this time of year that this information gets out.